Dorothy, you aren't family. You're the help. Stay and watch the kids. My mother's smile was a razor, and the silence that followed was a physical blow. I stood up, the mahogany table trembling beneath my hands. Then have a nice trip, Lavinia. I'm busy headlining my own exhibition at Frieze, New York. The shock in that room was the first thing I'd truly felt in years, but that moment of reckoning was still hours away, hidden behind the exhausting, invisible routine that had already begun in the pitch-black silence of 5 a.m. The limestone walls of the Dixon Manor have always felt less like a home and more like a curated museum of things my father owned. At 5 a.m., the air inside the Greenwich estate is a heavy, recycled chill that tastes of lemon wax and expensive silence. I moved through the grand foyer, my footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs, feeling like a ghost haunting a life I was still technically living. The anniversary gala was 14 hours away, and as the youngest, the invisible architect of the family, the weight of 40 years of my parents' marriage rested entirely on my shoulders. I spent the pre-dawn hours coordinating with the floral designers, ensuring the white lilies were placed exactly 3 inches apart, just as Lavinia, my mother, demanded. While my sister Ariadne slept in the east wing, dreaming of the luxury Maui sun, I was checking the temperature of the wine cellar. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from the knowledge that your labor is expected, yet never acknowledged. It's a quiet erosion of the soul. While organizing the centerpiece for the head table, I found a small, withered flower tucked inside an old silver bowl, a remnant from my mother's original wedding bouquet decades ago. It was brittle, nearly dust, yet I carefully placed it in a silk pouch. Despite the coldness that defined our dinner table, I still respected the history. I still held on to the hope that beneath the granite there was a heart beating. Grace is not the absence of struggle. It is the dignity we maintain when the world tries to make us small. By noon, the house was a hive of activity. Ariadne floated through the rooms, her voice a sharp, piercing staccato as she issued demands for her children's snacks and her own specific brand of mineral water. I managed a crisis with the vintage wine delivery, a high-stakes logistical nightmare involving a broken crate and a frantic driver, and rearranged the seating chart for the 3rd time. Ariadne's requests weren't just demands, they were tests of my endurance. Dorothy, make sure the children's table is far enough away so the noise doesn't bother the senator, she said without looking up from her phone. I nodded, my throat tight. In the hallway, I crossed paths with my father, Bartholomew. He paused, his presence looming like the heavy oak furniture he loved so much. For a fleeting second, I thought he might ask if I had eaten or if I was tired. Instead, he simply stood there, chin tilted. Dorothy, my tie is uneven. Fix it, he commanded. I stepped forward, my fingers working the silk knot. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the wall behind me. He treated me like a valet, a convenient fixture of his lifestyle. You've built a remarkable legacy, Father, I said softly, a genuine attempt at a bridge. The house looks beautiful for tonight. He grunted, stepping back once the tie was perfect. Don't be late for the kitchen transition. The caterers need a lead, and I won't have the Dixon name embarrassed by a slow service. He walked away before I could respond. True character is found in how we treat those who can do absolutely nothing for us, and in this house, I was the one who did everything while being treated as if I could do nothing. As the sun began to dip, painting the Greenwich sky in bruised purples and golds, the first prestigious guests began to arrive. The gravel driveway crunched under the weight of German-engineered SUVs and Italian sports cars. I stood near the grand entrance for a moment, wearing a simple black dress I'd tailored myself. It was elegant, understated, and honest. Lavinia appeared suddenly, her hand gripping my upper arm with surprising strength. She didn't offer a greeting. She hissed under her breath, her eyes scanning the arriving crowd. What are you doing out here? Look at you. You look like a common girl trying too hard. Before I could speak, she began maneuvering me toward the service hallway, away from the light. Your servant energy is going to ruin the aesthetic of the family portrait. Go to the kitchen. Stay out of the sightlines until the dinner service. The air left my lungs. The humiliation was a physical weight, a cold blade between the ribs. 30 pairs of eyes from the elite of Connecticut were starting to filter in, and my own mother was treating me like a stain on the carpet. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and felt like an absolute stranger? It's a silence that screams. I stopped moving. I looked at Lavinia, seeing the cracks in her foundation for the first time. "I prepared this house for your joy, Mother," I said, my voice quiet but devastatingly steady. "My presence doesn't diminish your light unless you choose to see it that way. But if you want me in the kitchen, I will go. Just remember who kept the lights on while you were busy looking in the mirror." She recoiled as if I'd slapped her, her mouth thinning into a line of pure resentment. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I turned and walked into the shadows of the service wing. Behind me, I heard the forced melodic laughter of high society, the clinking of crystal, and the hollow praise of a life built on appearances. My eyes were no longer stinging. They were hardening with a new, intellectual clarity. I finally understood that a house built on the exclusion of its own foundation cannot stand forever. The laughter from the ballroom echoed down the hallway, a hollow, rhythmic sound that grated against the newfound silence in my chest. I didn't return to the kitchen. Instead, I stood in the dim corridor of the West Wing, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light beneath the library door. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum, no longer the frantic beat of a girl seeking approval, but the cold cadence of a woman calculating her exit. The stone walls of this house had held me for 32 years, yet as I stood there, I felt like a stranger viewing a crime scene. A shadow broke the light under the door. Ariadne stepped out, her silk dress rustling like a warning. She didn't look surprised to find me there. She looked expectant. With a flick of her wrist, she gestured for me to follow her into the wood-paneled library. The scent of old leather and expensive scotch hit me, a suffocating mix that usually made me shrink. Not tonight. I walked in, my chin tilted just enough to meet her gaze. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Ariadne thrust a heavy, cream-colored document onto the mahogany desk, her manicured nail tapping the signature line with a sharp, impatient click. "Sign it, Dorothy," she commanded, her voice thin and sharp as a paper cut. "It's a family support agreement. Since you're staying behind anyway, I need legal assurance that you'll handle the children's schedules, their medical needs, and the estate maintenance while we're in Maui. I can't have your moods disrupting my vacation." I looked down at the paper. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a 24/7 unpaid labor contract disguised as sisterly cooperation. It even included a clause about forfeiture of family discretionary funds if I failed to meet her standards. Ariadne leaned against the desk, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Be useful for once. No one is ever going to marry someone as bland and invisible as you, so you might as well serve the people who actually have real lives to live." I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, detached pity for her. Ariadne was so consumed by the theater of her own importance that she couldn't see the woman standing right in front of her. I remembered a thought my Aunt Elodie used to share. Kindness is a language that even the deaf can hear, and the blind can see. I wondered if Ariadne had ever heard a single word of it. "I hope one day you learn to speak that language, Ariadne," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It's a tragedy to be so loud and yet say so little of value." I picked up the fountain pen. My hand was steady, a contrast to the slight tremor in Ariadne's fingers as she realized I wasn't arguing. I signed the document with a flourish. I wasn't signing away my freedom, I was signing a distraction. I needed them to believe I was firmly under their thumb until the very moment I vanished toward New York. To win a war against people who think you are a pawn, you must first play the part of the pawn perfectly. That was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. I left the library without waiting for her response, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I intended to head to the basement to check on my hidden canvases, but a low murmur caught my ear. It was coming from Bartholomew's study. The door was cracked, a sliver of warm light spilling onto the dark hallway floor. I heard Thayer, my brother-in-law, laughing. It was that rich, entitled laugh of a man who has never been told no. "It's a brilliant setup, Bart," Thayer said. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass. Between the estate management and the nanny fees we're avoiding by keeping the girl here, we're saving upwards of $100,000 a year. She's the perfect hedge against our overhead. My father's voice followed, heavy and resonant. Dorothy is our free labor insurance. We've kept her dependent for a reason. If she ever realized her worth, we'd be in a massive deficit. As long as she thinks she's helping, she'll never ask for a seat at the table. She's not a daughter, Thayer. She's a dividend. I leaned my forehead against the cool wallpaper, my knuckles whitening around the strap of my camera bag. The air felt thin, the hallway suddenly too narrow for my breath. My father, the man whose legacy I had spent the morning praising, wasn't just neglecting me. He was farming me. I was a line item in his financial diversification strategy. In that moment, the last fragment of my yearning for his love turned to ash. I realized that the most dangerous walls aren't made of stone. They are the ones we build out of the expectations of people who only value us for what they can take. I didn't burst through the door. I didn't scream. I didn't even let a single tear fall. I took a deep, deliberate breath, practicing the stoicism that had become my armor. I walked past the grand mirror in the foyer and stopped. I didn't see the tired, erased girl I had been this morning. I saw an artist who was currently being vetted for one of the most prestigious exhibitions in the country. I saw a woman who held the master keys to their digital lives and their corporate secrets. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A notification from Stellan. Portfolio received. The committee is stunned. You're in, Dorothy. Welcome to Freeze. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I looked at my reflection and whispered, "Forgiveness doesn't mean I accept your behavior. It means I no longer let your shadows define my light." I felt a profound sense of release. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was no longer an anchor. It was fuel. I understood then that I had already won. They were still playing a game of checkers in a house they thought they owned, while I was playing a game of chess in a world they couldn't even imagine. I adjusted my posture, feeling the phantom weight of my camera against my side. I descended the stairs, returning to the gala with a secret that would soon shatter the Dixon legacy. I walked back into the light, moving through the crowd of socialites and power brokers with a newfound grace. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a ghost in the machine, waiting for the right moment to turn the power off. Have you ever felt the sheer power of knowing something that could change everything while the world around you remains blissfully unaware? It's a quiet, terrifying kind of joy. I watched my mother laugh with a senator's wife. I watched my father shake hands with a developer. I watched them all and realized that the free labor they relied on was about to become the most expensive mistake they ever made. I had been their foundation for too long, and foundations, when they finally shift, tend to bring the whole house down with them. The mahogany staircase groaned under my weight as I descended into the bowels of the manor. The festive music from the gala was a dying pulse above me, replaced by the damp, rhythmic thrum of the furnace. I didn't turn on the overhead lights immediately. I let the darkness of the basement settle around me, a familiar cloak that didn't demand a smile or a service. This was the only place in Greenwich where my breath felt like my own. I moved toward my small studio corner, a sanctuary of canvases and charcoal dust tucked behind the industrial water heaters. I needed to begin the final backup of my digital archives, but my foot caught on something unfamiliar. A sleek black leather folder lay abandoned near the furnace, likely dropped by Thayer earlier in the evening during one of his self-important tours of the estate's infrastructure. I picked it up, intending to set it on the workbench, but a single sheet of paper slipped out. The header was embossed with the seal of a private equity firm. My eyes tracked the text with an analytical coldness I'd learned from years of doing the family's taxes. It was a memorandum of understanding regarding Bartholomew's personal liabilities. My father was drowning. A series of bad offshore investments had left him owing nearly $7 million to a 65-year-old business tycoon in Chicago. Then, I saw my own name, Dorothy Dixon. I was listed under a section titled Strategic Social Assets. The memorandum detailed a plan to facilitate an introduction and courtship between myself and the tycoon's eldest son. It wasn't an invitation, it was a transaction. The document outlined how my financial dependence and lack of outside ties made me the ideal candidate to seal a merger that would effectively erase my father's debt. They weren't just using my labor. They were preparing to sell my future to cover their failures. Have you ever looked at a piece of paper and seen your entire autonomy signed away by the people who were supposed to protect you? I sat on a wooden stool, the paper trembling in my hand. True freedom is not doing what you want, but not having to do what you don't want. My father had spent 30 years making me feel small so that I would be easier to trade when the bill finally came due. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a mortgage payment. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my camera bag. My no was no longer just a word. It had to become a fortress. The basement door at the top of the stairs creaked open, a vertical bar of sterile light cutting through the shadows. I heard the rhythmic clip-clop of designer heels. Lavinia. The scent of her Chanel No. 5 reached me before she did, an intrusive floral perfume that felt like a violation of the workshop's scent of turpentine and old wood. She stood at the base of the stairs, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving. "Dorothy, what are you doing down here in the dark?" she asked, her voice dripping with that habitual condescension. She didn't wait for an answer. She began walking through my studio, her eyes raking over my canvases with undisguised disdain. She stopped at my latest work, a portrait of an elderly woman at a bus stop, a piece I'd spent 6 months perfecting. "This cluttered dungeon needs to be cleared out," she said, her manicured hand dismissively waving at my life's work. Ariadne decided she wants a wellness suite, a place for her yoga and meditation. Since you'll be busy with the children anyway, you won't have time for this pathological hobby. We'll have the movers take all this to the landfill while we're in Maui. I felt the air leave the room. It was a calculated strike, a systematic dismantling of the last inch of space I owned. She told me my only future was the one the family provided, her voice a soothing poison, completely unaware that I had just read the contract for my own sale. "I have always tried to bring beauty into this house, Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. "It is a tragedy that you only see value in things you can sell or paint over." Lavinia laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Beauty doesn't pay for the lifestyle you enjoy, Dorothy. Utility does. Now get upstairs. You have packing to finish for Ariadne." She turned and left, the basement door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in my bones. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of pity for her. She was so enslaved by the theater of status that she had forgotten how to love anything she couldn't use as a prop. I stood in the silence, but I didn't weep. Grieving for a family that never existed is a waste of a life. I turned to my computer and began the systematic process of backing up every single high-resolution file to an encrypted cloud drive. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, but ridding yourself of toxic people is a gift you give your future. I was no longer a victim of their shadowed plots. I was the architect of my own escape. I sent a secure, one-word message to Stellan in New York. Confirmed. I looked up at a small, framed photo of my grandmother pinned to the wall. She was the only one who had ever seen the light in my eyes without trying to put it out. I whispered to her image, "Losing a family that never saw you isn't a loss. It's an inheritance of self." I moved to my camera bag and carefully placed the withered flower I'd found earlier inside a protective sleeve. It was the only thing from the Dixon estate I intended to keep, a reminder that beauty can survive even in a house of stone. I checked the lock on the back basement door, the one that led to the gravel path and the world beyond. I looked at that basement door one last time, a quiet power rising in my chest. I knew that when I finally walked through it, I would be someone they no longer had the power to reach. The shadows were no longer a place where I hid. They were the place where I was becoming someone new. Sometimes, the most important work happens in the dark. The morning sun bled through the sheer curtains of the breakfast nook, casting long, deceptive shadows across the polished silverware. For 3 decades, this light had signaled another day of invisible labor. But today, it felt like the slow rolling tide before a tsunami. I moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, pouring coffee for Lavinia and arranging Ariadne's vitamins. To them, I was the same compliant Dorothy, the one who settled into the background like expensive wallpaper. They saw my silence as submission. They didn't know it was the silence of a fuse burning toward a payload. I spent the early hours assisting my mother with the final, intricate details of the Hawaii itinerary. I confirmed the private car to the airport, cross-referenced the resort bookings, and printed the boarding passes with a precision that bordered on the clinical. Lavinia watched me over the rim of her porcelain cup, her expression softened by a rare, smug satisfaction. She assumed I had finally swallowed my pride and accepted my role as the family's permanent anchor. It's funny how people perceive humility as weakness when, in reality, it is often the ultimate strategic vantage point. True humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less, allowing you to focus entirely on the objective. Later, I found myself in Ariadne's suite, surrounded by open trunks and designer labels. My sister was frantic, tossing garments aside while complaining about the humid Maui forecast. I sat on the edge of the bed and began mending a small, jagged tear in her son's favorite teddy bear. My fingers moved with a tenderness that seemed to catch Ariadne off guard. She paused her tirade, watching my needle dive and surface through the worn fur. "You really were born to serve, weren't you, Dorothy?" she remarked, her voice a mix of genuine confusion and habitual mockery. "It's almost fascinating. Most people have ambitions. You just have chores." I tied a neat knot and snipped the thread, handing the toy back to her. I didn't feel the old sting of her words. I felt a profound, intellectual distance. "We are all born to serve something, Ariadne," I replied with a faint, steady smile. "I have simply decided that from now on, my service should be to the truth, rather than to a performance." She rolled her eyes, missing the weight of my words entirely. I didn't care. I wasn't speaking for her benefit anymore. I was speaking to the woman I was becoming. I left her suite and climbed the stairs to the one place in this house where they never ventured, the attic. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the scent of cedar, a heavy, airless space that felt like a legal fortress. This was where I finalized the underground pipeline for my departure. I sat at my laptop, my heart thrumming as I confirmed the registration of my secret LLC, Dorothy's Light Artworks. According to U.S. intellectual property laws, the creator is the default owner unless a written work-for-hire agreement exists. My father, in his arrogance, had never bothered with such formalities. He assumed my blood made my talent his property. He was wrong. I spent the next hour coordinating a late-night pickup with a private fine art shipping firm. Aunt Elodie had arranged the logistics from Carmel, her voice over the phone a steadying anchor in my sea of nerves. "A wise woman builds her house on a foundation of facts, Dorothy," she had told me earlier. That way, when the winds of family drama blow, her walls won't even shiver. I felt a surge of strategic fire as I received an encrypted confirmation from Stellan. My profile was officially live in the Freeze New York VIP catalog. The pieces were no longer just paintings. They were recognized assets. Descending from the attic, I encountered Lavinia in the grand hallway. The mahogany-lined corridor felt like a tunnel closing in. Usually I would have averted my eyes, but today, I stood my ground. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, beautifully wrapped box. "I found this while I was organizing the storage rooms, Mother," I said, handing it to her. Lavinia frowned, her fingers fumbling with the ribbon. Inside was a small gold locket from my childhood, a piece she had once loved and thought was lost years ago during a move. It was a restored fragment of our shared history. Her face flickered with a momentary haunting recognition, a ghost of the mother she might have been before status became her only religion. This act of kindness felt insane given the circumstances, but I needed to pay my final debts of affection. I wanted to leave this house with a clean conscience, knowing I had offered grace even to those who didn't deserve it. You cannot pour from an empty cup, but you also cannot force someone to drink from a cup of love they no longer recognize. "Is this a guilt trip, Dorothy?" Lavinia snapped, the moment of softness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Because you're still not going to Hawaii. Don't think a piece of old jewelry compensates for the fact that you've been moping around all week. Put it on my vanity and get back to work." I watched her walk away, the locket dangling carelessly from her hand. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a strange, cold relief. The debt was settled. I had offered her a bridge, and she had used it to reinforce her wall. I stepped into the center of the main hall and looked up at the enormous family portraits lining the corridor. They appeared in perfect, dignified poses, Bartholomew's hand resting on Lavinia's shoulder, Ariadne smiling radiantly. I stood at the center of the frame like a living ghost in their staged reality. Exactly 72 hours later, the composition of this family would change irreversibly. I would be the only one absent from the painting, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence in this house would finally belong to me. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and old lies. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even angry. I was simply waiting for the clock to strike 0. That's the thing about a storm. The most dangerous part isn't the wind or the rain. It's the deceptive, crushing quiet that comes just before the sky breaks open. The grand ballroom of the Dixon Manor was a masterclass in gilded deception. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured amber light over 50 of Connecticut's most influential figures, their laughter rising in a coordinated symphony of clinking silverware and rehearsed charm. I moved through the crowd with the invisible precision I had perfected over a lifetime, ensuring the Cabernet was at the perfect temperature and the hors d'oeuvres were replenished before a single guest could notice a void. In this room, I was the ghost who kept the machine running, a shadow serving the suns that refused to acknowledge my orbit. As I circulated, I noticed Mrs. Gable, an elderly family friend, struggling with her wrap near the drafty terrace entrance. I stepped forward, gently assisting her, my hands steady and my smile genuine. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Gable. The evening air is a bit sharper than expected." She patted my hand, her eyes kind, a rare moment of human warmth in a desert of social performance. It was a reminder that my spirit remained unbroken. Despite the coldness of my own blood, I still knew how to offer kindness to a stranger. True nobility is not being superior to your fellow man, but being superior to your former self. I had outgrown the need to be seen by this table long before the first course was served. Bartholomew stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his tuxedo fitting him like armor. He raised his glass, the light catching the deep red of the wine I had poured. "To family!" he boomed, his voice resonant with a pride that didn't include the daughter standing 3 feet behind him. "To loyalty, to legacy, and to the strength of the Dixon name." His eyes never flickered toward me. They stayed locked on the wealthy investors and political allies seated at his right hand. I was merely a dividend of his domestic management, a line item that didn't merit a mention in the toast. The atmosphere shifted as the dessert was cleared. Lavinia stood up, her diamonds flashing like warning lights under the chandeliers. She clinked her Waterford crystal, the sharp, crystalline ring cutting through the chatter. "Bartholomew and I have a surprise announcement," she said, her voice melodic and staged. "To celebrate 40 years of our perfect union, we are taking the family on a grand celebratory trip. Next week, the Dixons will be at the Four Seasons in Maui for 10 days of sun, sea, and celebration." The room erupted in polite applause. Ariadne squealed, clutching Thayer's arm, her face glowing with the anticipation of a luxury vacation she hadn't earned. I felt a flicker of the old hope, a small, foolish spark that perhaps, in this milestone moment, the exclusion was finally over. I stepped forward slightly, the words escaping before I could catch them. "What time is our flight, Mother?" The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was deafening. It was a physical weight that pressed the air from the room. 50 guests froze, their forks suspended, their smiles becoming brittle masks. Lavinia didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with a chilling, detached amusement, as if I were a pet that had suddenly tried to speak at the dinner table. "You don't need to know the flight time, Dorothy," Lavinia said, her voice dropping into a register of icy clarity that echoed off the limestone walls. "You aren't family for this trip. Someone has to stay behind and manage the kids and the estate while we have a real vacation. You don't have a husband or a career to worry about, so it's only logical." The public erasure was complete. It wasn't just a snub, it was a formal declaration of my non-existence in front of the people who defined our social world. I felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes, some pitying, most indifferent, all witnessing my execution. In that moment, the old Dorothy, the one who yearned for a seat at that table, died. Silence is sometimes the loudest answer, and I realized that dignity is the best revenge. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply breathed. "I understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper but reaching every corner of the silent hall. I stood up. I didn't move toward the kitchen. I moved toward the head of the table. The posture I had cultivated in the basement, the strength of the woman who had built a secret empire of light and shadow, finally took command. I placed my tablet on the center of the mahogany table, right next to Lavinia's hand. "Since we're discussing schedules," I began, my voice gaining a resonance that startled Bartholomew, "I have one of my own to announce." I tapped the screen, and the VIP digital invitation from Frieze, New York projected onto the large white wall behind the head table, the bold typography of the art world's most prestigious event dwarfing the Dixon family portraits. "Twist, Dorothy Dixon, featured artist," the header read. Beneath it was a scrolling gallery of my $1 million portfolio. The room gasped. Ariadne's mouth fell open. Bartholomew's glass hit the table with a dull thud. "I'm sorry, Lavinia," I said, using her name for the first time in my life, the syllables feeling like a final severance. "But I'm far too busy presenting my work to international collectors and the Manhattan press to be your unpaid babysitter. My opening is at Randall's Island, next Tuesday, exactly when your flight leaves." Bartholomew found his voice first, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He slammed his hand on the table, the silver rattling. "This is preposterous. Dorothy, you are an amateur. Anything you've done in this house belongs to the Dixon estate. It was produced under my roof with my resources. You have no legal claim to this nonsense." He was trying to claim ownership of my soul's labor, using the same corporate bullying tactics he used in the boardroom. But I had spent years as his accountant. I knew the law better than he knew his own children. "Ownership is a legal fiction in this case, Father," I said, my eyes meeting his without a hint of fear. "I registered my LLC years ago. I have documented every cent of my own earnings from my remote accounting work to fund my art. But more importantly, respect is an earned reality. You have neither the legal right nor the moral standing to claim a single brushstroke." The silence returned, but this time, it belonged to me. I looked at Lavinia, who was staring at the projection of my work, a haunting portrait of a woman fading into the woodwork, and saw the exact moment she realized the woman she had tried to erase was the only one in the room with true power. "I won't be in Maui," I said, my voice steady as stone, "and I won't be in the kitchen." I turned my back on the table. I didn't run. I walked with a measured, cinematic pace toward the foyer. As I reached the grand doors, I saw a local social journalist in the corner, her phone held high, the flash capturing the silhouette of my exit. The Dixons were no longer the perfect family. They were just people sitting in a large, cold room, choking on a truth they had tried so hard to bury. I walked toward the front door, the cool Greenwich night air a promise awaiting me. I didn't look back. I had been a shadow in that house for 32 years, but when the door closed behind me, the shadows vanished. I was stepping into the light, no longer afraid of being seen. The morning after the gala arrived with a cold gray light that made the limestone walls of the Dixon Manor look like a fortress under siege. Upstairs, the frantic thud of luggage being dragged across hardwood floors signaled the family's impending departure for Hawaii. I stood in the grand foyer, my coat already on, watching the dust motes settle in the wake of my mother's hurried footsteps. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, a digital, invisible paralysis. For years, I had been the silent glue holding their administrative world together. Today, I had simply stopped being the adhesive. The screaming started in Bartholomew's study. It was a raw, primal sound of a man discovering his kingdom was no longer his to command. Bartholomew stormed into the hallway, his face a dangerous shade of crimson, clutching his tablet like a weapon. Behind him, Thayer followed, his usual corporate composure replaced by a look of sheer, bug-eyed panic. They had reached the gate of their financial fortress, only to find that the keys no longer turned. "Dorothy! What have you done?" Bartholomew roared, his voice shaking the crystal sconces. "I can't access the corporate payroll. The offshore accounts are locked. Everything is under a 256-bit encryption I don't recognize." I didn't flinch. I looked at him with a calm, analytical, steady gaze. "Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching, Father. But accountability is what happens when you don't. I have simply rescinded the administrative privileges I provided as an unpaid consultant for the last 5 years." I pulled a formal digital log from my bag, a document detailing every hour of labor I had poured into the Dixon name without a single cent of compensation. According to U.S. labor law, specifically regarding intellectual property created without a contract, the work belongs to my LLC. I wasn't stealing their data, I was securing my own labor. I had spent a lifetime fixing their mistakes for free, and now I was finally closing the ledger. "I am not breaking this family, Father," I said, my voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "I am simply stopping the repair work I've been doing for free. If you want the master keys, I will hand them over, once I am safely in New York and my work is debuted at Freeze. Until then, your lives are on a brief, necessary pause." The silence that followed was a high-stakes standoff. Bartholomew's eyes darted toward Thayer, looking for a legal loophole, but Thayer's silence confirmed what they both knew. They had no leg to stand on. I wasn't a thief. I was a creditor who had finally called in a debt they never intended to pay. But my father was not a man to go quietly into the night. In a sudden, cinematic burst of aggression, he lunged for the heavy oak doors of the study, slamming them shut and twisting the heavy brass bolt. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the airless room. I was trapped inside his sanctuary of leather and mahogany, a space designed to intimidate. "You aren't going anywhere, Dorothy," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and desperation. "I'll call the Greenwich police. I'll report you for industrial espionage and the theft of family trade secrets. I will bury you so deep in litigation you'll never see a gallery wall again." Outside the door, Ariadne's voice rose in a shrill, weaponized cry. She pounded on the wood, her words dripping with a toxic entitlement that made my skin crawl. "You're killing this family, Dorothy. I'm pregnant, I'm exhausted, and you're ruining the only vacation we've had in years. Do you have any idea what this is doing to our reputation?" I wasn't afraid. I sat down in Bartholomew's oversized leather chair, not out of arrogance, but because my feet needed a firm footing. I recalled a truth that had helped me get through many dark nights in this house. Strength doesn't come from victory. It is through hardship and challenges that you become strong. They were ready to use the full power of the American legal system to further enslave me. It was a level of insane, desperate cruelty that only proved I was right to leave. I took a slow, deliberate breath and pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't call the police. I activated a prearranged distress signal, a silent digital flare that triggered a response from Stellan and a team of high-profile art law attorneys in Manhattan. The siege was no longer silent. "Father," I said, my voice coming from a place of cold, untouchable logic. "You can call the police. In fact, I encourage it. But you should know that a group of New York journalists is already waiting at the manor's gates. They aren't here for a scandal. They're here to interview the breakout star of Freeze, New York." Bartholomew froze, his hand hovering over the desk phone. "If the police arrive," I continued, "this ceases to be a private family matter. It becomes a publicity nightmare. I will be forced to explain the unpaid labor logs. I will have to show them the Strategic Social Asset Memorandum where you tried to sell me to cover your debts. The Dixon name will be synonymous with exploitation before your flight even leaves the tarmac." I stood up, walking toward the locked door. "I don't want your downfall, Bartholomew. I only want my freedom. I will not tell the press what you tried to do today if you let me walk out that door with my dignity. The choice is yours. Keep me here and lose everything, or let me go and keep your secrets." The room grew heavy with the weight of his decision. I watched the gears turning behind his eyes as his social capital was weighed against his pride. The sound of a heavy vehicle, Stellan's car, approached the gravel driveway, the crunch of tires sounding like the arrival of an army. I stood there, a woman who had finally learned that my value was not determined by their need for me. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Bartholomew reached for the bolt. The metallic slide of the lock was the loudest sound I'd ever heard in that house. He didn't look at me as the door swung open. He looked at the floor, a defeated king in a hollow castle. The locks clicked open, not because they loved me, but because they finally feared the woman I had become. I stood on the porch, my single suitcase by my side, watching the house for the last time. Inside, the manor was a frantic hive of activity. My family was rushing to pack for their Maui departure, their voices clashing in the hallway like broken glass. For 30 years, I had been the one to smooth the jagged edges of their lives. Now, I was simply the one walking away from the wreckage. Ariadne lunged onto the porch, her face flushed with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. She was holding her youngest son, who was wailing for a favorite toy I usually kept tracked in a dedicated spreadsheet. "Dorothy, you can't do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking over the child's cries. "I don't know where the medication logs are. I don't know the nanny's emergency contact. You're leaving me with nothing." I looked at my sister, and to my own surprise, I felt a deep, genuine compassion. I wasn't leaving because I hated her. I was leaving because I finally loved myself more than I feared her anger. I reached into my bag and handed her a neatly organized digital tablet. "I didn't leave you with nothing, Ariadne. I left you with the truth. All the passwords, schedules, and contacts are here. Use the money you saved by not paying me all these years to hire the professional help you deserve." She stared at the tablet, speechless for the first time in her life. I understood then that freedom is not the right to do as we please, but the opportunity to do what is right for our own soul. My departure was the only way to break the cycle of her dependence and my resentment. It was the kindest thing I could do for both of us. Dorothy was no longer a name that meant servant. It was a name that meant gone. I stepped into the car without looking back at the limestone walls. The driver pulled away, and the heavy gates of the Dixon estate vanished into the rear-view mirror. As we crossed the bridge toward Manhattan, I felt the air in my lungs change. It was lighter, sharper, and smelled of the salt coming off the East River. We were heading toward Randall's Island, the heart of Freeze, New York, and toward a life I had built in the shadows. Arriving at the Freeze Pavilion was like stepping into a different dimension. The atmosphere was a vibrant, high-energy pulse of intellectual curiosity and world-class ambition. Stellan was waiting for me at the entrance, his eyes filled with a level of professional respect I had never encountered in Greenwich. He didn't ask me to fix a tie or pour a drink. He took my hand and led me toward the center of the exhibition space. There, under the bright, gallery-grade lights, sat my series, The Transparent Daughter. I stopped in my tracks. For the first time, my work wasn't hidden in a damp basement. It was the focal point of the conversation. I watched as people stood in a profound, respectful silence before my portraits of the invisible women. I saw a woman in her 60s wipe a tear from her eye as she looked at a shot of an elderly janitor. Art is not what you see, but what you make others see. After a lifetime of being erased, the world was finally seeing through my eyes. A prominent museum collector approached me later that afternoon. He didn't talk down to me. He talked to me as a peer. The price he offered for the primary series was enough to secure my financial independence for the next decade. It confirmed what I had always known in the dark. My pathological hobby was actually a world-class calling. The validation wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that I no longer needed to ask for permission to exist. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a golden hue over the East River, I walked to the edge of the Randall's Island pier. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A final, desperate text from Lavinia. "Dorothy, the server passwords you gave Ariadne aren't working for the flight check-in. We're going to miss the Maui flight. Fix this now." I looked at the message, the frantic energy of it feeling like a relic from a past life. I knew the passwords worked fine. Lavinia just didn't know how to navigate a system she had never bothered to learn. I typed a short, steady response. "The debt is paid. I am no longer your help. I am your daughter, from a distance. The passwords are correct. You simply have to pay attention. Have a safe trip to Hawaii." This final act was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Boundaries are the only way to love a toxic family without losing yourself. I was choosing a future of civil distance over a past of intimate exploitation. I wasn't running away. I had simply arrived at my own front door. I switched off my phone. I raised my camera, pointing the lens toward the New York skyline as the sunlight streamed through the windows of the skyscrapers. The air was chilly, the wind strong, but I no longer felt like a ghost. Today I was seeing the world through my lens for the last time. Not to escape, but to finally immerse myself in the light. I know many of you have spent years being the silent, solid pillar for people who never acknowledge the burden you're carrying. Have you ever reached a breaking point where you finally had to choose yourself over being the servant? Share your story in the comments below. I'm reading every single one.